All right, let's start. Good morning. My name is Jürgen Steinmetz, and I'm joining you from World Tourism Network in Honolulu in cooperation with eTurboNews, live stream Hawaii News Online, and uh, and you see us on social media, and you can see us live also and be part of this live audience. Today we have an interesting panel, and we'll be talking about climate-friendly travel to zero. Before I introduce this panel and give my microphone to Professor Jeffrey Lipman in Brussels, I just wanted to remind everyone who is not a member of the World Tourism Network, you can actually join World Tourism Network complimentary now between now and the end of the year if you join by the 14th of June. Simply go to wtn.travel, click on join, and you put in the promotional code free 2021. So this should be good incentive to be part of us. And this free offer applies to corporate membership. It doesn't apply to individual memberships because there's a free option already, and it's only $10 a month for an individual membership. We're leaving right now. However, World Tourism Network started more than a year ago in March of 2020 with a discussion, what was known under rebuilding travel. And the entire year we focused on bringing people together from all parts of the world and talking about the implementation of COVID on the travel and tourism industry. So this has gone a long way. Everyone has been on this journey. So we are continuing. And in December, we formed an organization. What is the World Tourism Network? What will not only, of course, deal with the COVID crisis, but we see our rightful place in the global travel industry as someone who is focusing on medium to small size businesses in this world. We have members now in 127 countries, close to 2,000, and we're growing. And I can see some of our board members and people that have been with us from the very beginning, like Peter Bryan from Tanzania, Marika from the Tour Guide Association in Washington, D.C., and of course, everyone on this panel today also has been part of our audience. I wanted to welcome Modi Astudi in Indonesia. She has been with us for a while, and many of you. I cannot mention all of them, and they're coming in, but we have a loyal followership of people all over the world. Now, without further delay, I'd like to give this microphone to Jeffrey Lipman and also, of course, welcoming VJ. Oh, no, VJ, I'm so sorry. I know you for so many years. I'm going to call him VJ. Not stumbling over your last name is even more difficult than my last name for some people. But VJ has been leading and chairing our aviation group, and World Tourism Network has interest groups. And aviation, of course, is very important. VJ has been with us also from the almost from the beginning. And he is a consultant based, an aviation consultant, very well known in this business for many years, based in Singapore. And he was a VP for Etihad Airways before. And we have Paul Steele, he's joining us from beautiful Switzerland. And Professor Jeffrey Lipman, I think doesn't need much of an introduction, joining us from Brussels. So Jeffrey, the floor is yours and the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And again, thank you to you and World Tourism Network for facilitating what I'm going to call a fireside chat about the existential climate crisis and the place of aviation in that crisis, and particularly focusing on the challenges and the opportunities that are emerging in a post-pandemic period. And I'm not going and we might start with the G7 and the fact in the G7 communique, the climate crisis is identified as perhaps the greatest significant crisis facing humanity. And the reality that if we don't fix this in a very relatively short time period, then life is to be what Rousseau called nasty, brutish, and short. Mm-hmm. It's getting worse. Paris Agreement talked about 1.5 degrees. According to the latest statistics, we are already sitting at 1.2 degrees. And the World Meteorological Organization has said there's a significant chance in a recent report that we will pass 1.5 degrees within this decade. And that means terrible weather extremes, floods, ice caps melting, forest fires, dreadful hurricanes, and of course a massive climate migration. Some people are projecting 100 million climate refugees if we get to that stage. Is a pivotal part of the global socio-economic I don't need to go into that for this audience because we are all reading the figures about basically directly and indirectly 10% of the global economy. And what has been made even more clear by the pandemic is that the drivers of the economy, travel and tourism is one of the drivers. We are looking at a situation of a pandemic emergence, however long it takes, 1, 2, 3 years, nobody knows, which the Secretary General of the United Nations says of tourism, it should be safe, it should be sustainable, and it should be climate friendly. Now, in the NGO that I run, a testament to Maurice Strong, who was warning about the climate crisis 50 years ago, we are advocating a need for climate-friendly travel. That's a form of travel and tourism which is low carbon, which is to the Sustainable Development Paris 1.5 trajectory. At this moment, and I would add, we're also calling for absolute zero greenhouse gas by 2050. Let me repeat that. Absolute zero greenhouse gas by 2050. And for those of you who are following this story, that doesn't mean net zero, where you offset certain elements of your emissions, because clearly, if the world does not achieve that kind of balance, we're going to go into a dreadful, dreadful civilization-ending period. Aviation is currently somewhere between 2 to 3% of the total greenhouse gas and of the total carbon emissions. But it's also responsible for some other nasty stuff like sulfur and nitrous-based emissions, and for what is called radiative forcing. That's the impact of contrails and and other disturbing effects at high altitudes. But the 3% is forecast to grow dramatically because every other form of human activity is looking at our energy system. Every other form. So relatively, aviation, unless it can, is going to be emerging as an even greater climate challenge. And some studies, 15% by 2050 of global carbon will be caused by aviation. The question that can this be fixed? Can this be fixed? We're going to talk about things like short-haul electric plane fuel mandates, hydrogen propulsion, and some other big technology. Said we have 3 world experts with us, and in this order I'm going to ask them to give us some thoughts. First, Paul Steele, the former and a long-time sustainability campaigner as the Chief Operating Officer of WWF. And Paul will be followed by Vijay Punasamy, former VP of Etihad as Senior Executive Legal Officer at Air Mauritius. I met Vijay the first time at the first ICAO World Air Transport Conference, the honor of being the president of that conference. And last but not least, Chris Lyle, former director of the Aviation Organization and an advisor to the UN World Tourism Organization, and a man with whom I played rugby in Montreal many, many years ago. You're also welcome, Chris. So with that introduction, I'm now going to ask Paul.
Jeffrey, if I can interrupt you a little bit.
To give us...
Jeffrey, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you're really coming in and out. We don't understand everything you're saying, but most. I don't know if you have a different internet you could possibly switch to. But I just
okay, look, I'm going to introduce Paul Steele. I'm going to introduce Paul Steele, and I'm going to come in. I'm going to leave and come in on another line. Paul.
All right, Jeffrey, thank you, and hi everyone. What I could say at the moment is that this is probably one of the worst times to be involved in aviation. The industry has gone through absolutely the worst crisis in its more than 100-year history. But I would also say it's a very exciting time for aviation because it means that there's new impetus in terms of where does the industry go from here. And I think one of the things that the current crisis has also highlighted, as Jeffrey referred to, is the need to take the issue of climate change even more seriously. So Jeffrey called this session Decarbonizing Aviation and the Elephant in the Room. And he's already defined the size of the elephant being 2 to 3% of global man-made CO2 emissions. But it's not the size that's the problem. The problem is the growth, because prior to the pandemic, the industry was growing its traffic by about 5% per annum and its emissions by about 3% per annum. The problem with that is that if you extrapolate that forward, even post-pandemic, you're going to see a doubling, if not nearly tripling of emissions between now and 2050. Now, there is some good news in that the industry has been working on this for quite some time. There's been a huge focus on improving fuel efficiency. And over the last decade, the industry has actually improved its fuel efficiency on average by 2% every year. They've also set back in 2009 what were then ambitious targets of trying to stabilize emissions at the 2020 level, and then to try and reduce emissions by 50% compared to where they were in 2005. And the good news is that that work has continued and it goes on. The problem is, the big question is that enough? And of course, in today's world, with today's pressures, we can say that definitely it's not. So the industry needs to make an even bigger effort in terms of trying to address its impacts on climate change. There are already, as I said, measures in place. There is a global agreement on trying to limit emissions at what is now the 2019 level, not the 2020 level. But that is not going to get us to where we need to be, either at carbon neutral, which is where I think the industry might want to go next, or if it comes to carbon zero, which is where Jeffrey was saying the world needs to be, that is a huge challenge over this period of time. What's the problem? The problem is simple. Aviation uses one type of fuel, it's called kerosene. Every ton of kerosene it burns, it creates 3.16 tons of CO2. So the name of the game historically has been trying to reduce fuel burn. But the name of the game going forward is going to be trying to replace kerosene as the fuel of choice for the aviation industry. And here there's some really good news. So on the one side, over the last 10 years, there's been a huge amount of work developed. There are now 7 different pathways to producing what is called sustainable aviation fuel, largely produced from biological sources, but I will stress right up front, not from crops, which cause issues with deforestation, water use, and land use problems, but most of these fuels are being produced from waste materials, household waste, and also industrial waste. So there are 7 pathways that have already been developed to produce fuels that can be mixed interchangeably with kerosene, at the moment up to a 50% mix, and in the near future, it will be able to be used at 100% in existing aircraft. So you don't need to change the configuration of the aircraft. So that's a really exciting opportunity. If we got that right, we could reduce aviation's CO2 impacts by between 65 and 80% right there. So what's getting in the way? Well, largely, it's a matter of cost, it's a matter of investment, and quite frankly, in my view, it's a lack of joined up thinking by many governments around the world in really understanding the opportunity that sustainable alternative fuels represents. The other key developments are looking at completely different types of fuels, so what are called synfuels, made from carbon capture, where you can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and turn that into jet fuel. And there are other projects looking in the longer term at liquid hydrogen, for example. I'm not a fan of liquid hydrogen right now because there are enormous challenges that need to be overcome in terms of the production, the energy that needs to be put in there, the distribution, and you would have to redesign potentially the whole aviation fleet, which is a massive undertaking in itself. So for me, sustainable alternative fuels is the way to go. As I said, what is needed there is a new paradigm, a new thinking about how to make this happen. At the moment, it's individual airlines working with small fuel producers, and that is never going to deliver the scale that we are going to need in order to solve the problem. So we need something big. We need to think bigger. And Jeffrey, I'll give him credit for this, has called for what's known as an aviation moonshot, the same sort of thinking that Kennedy took into consideration in thinking about how to get a man on the moon. We need to rethink that for aviation. Aviation has its own UN body, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization. Chris will talk about that, I'm sure, in a moment. We have the next triennial assembly coming up in 2022, and that would be a golden opportunity to put more pressure. ICAO does not have a long-term emissions reduction goal, but also I think we need to put a lot more on the table in terms of getting governments united around the idea of promoting and prioritizing sustainable alternative fuels for aviation. So Jeffrey, I'll leave it right there. As I said, it's a huge challenge, but in my view, the solutions are there, but it needs a massive, massive push in order to get us over the line that we need to get to by 2050 or beyond.
Paul, thank you very much for that. Before asking Vijay to comment, can I just ask you one line of questioning? Everything I buy into your view on the importance of sustainable aviation fuels. Everything I read says the roadblock is the cost is too high and the amount of supply is too low. And yet we're dealing with the biggest companies on earth, the fossil fuel companies. And I understand that the line that I'm hearing is the market size isn't big enough. But if aviation is so important, and if this is, you know, the lifeline for human communications, for any intercontinental interaction, isn't it the case that these massive fuel companies should do a hell of a lot more to produce that fuel, point one? And point two, shouldn't the airlines simply have to say, if to be climate friendly, we have to have this fuel, if it's more expensive, the fares have to go up?
Well, Jeffrey, I think, look, the observation at the moment, we're in this horrible, what I call it, the valley of death. Okay, we did all the technical development work, and it's now the challenge of how do you actually commercialize and scale up production and distribution of these fuels. And that's where we are right now. So what we've got is small scale, and small scale means expensive. The challenge is to scale up, the unit costs come down, and it becomes much more competitive. There are already a couple of projects out there that actually are getting close to price competitivity, which is good. The problem, as you've highlighted, is it's not the big oil companies that are playing in this space. They're tinkering in the space, but they're not committed to this space. Where all the developments going on are new players, companies like Velocis, LanzaJet, Sky Energy. These were people that didn't exist 10 years ago, but they're the ones who pioneered all the technical work in terms of trying to get these projects off the ground. Where we're seeing a difference is when governments get involved to actually facilitate those projects through either investment guarantees or putting the right policy frameworks in place. And we need more of that, and we need some clarity in terms of how those policies could be put forward. And again, you know, you could pressurize the fossil fuel companies by putting in fuel mandates. Because the price differential at the moment is between 3 and 5 times the cost of kerosene, if you put a too big a mandate, then of course fares would go up. I shouldn't say this, having been in IATA for 13 years, airlines don't like the idea of fuel prices going up, but I think in moderation, it's something that could be passed on to the passenger, and the passenger would understand. But the problem at the moment is there's no government, if you like, thinking and safeguards around that it wouldn't get out of control.
Paul, I was in IATA for 20 years, and I'm reminded of the expression that politics is too important to be left to the politicians. And sometimes I think that the price that airlines have to pay may be too important just to be left to the airlines. And if the prices go up, there's a lot of environmentalists out there who will say that's not a bad thing, because it's going to mean that the demand is going to move more stably and have less of an adverse impact on the environment. But I'll leave it there.
Well, can I just make one point on that, Jeffrey?
course,
Let's not
of
forget
course.
that it's not just about people flying in aircraft. Aviation transports 35% of world trade by value. So if you increase fares, you increase cargo prices, you increase the cost of trade. So it needs to be done in a balanced way. It's not just a simple, let's put the price up, less people will fly, we solve the environment problem.
No, if I had a magic wand, I would say, let's put the price down and put the pressure on the fossil fuel companies. I can't feel much sympathy for them.
Okay, good.
Okay, Vijay, would you like to join this conversation and give us your views, which is the views of a practitioner, a man who's been running an airline, more than one airline, 3 airlines.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and great to see all our friends on this call. I think that there are a few givens which must probably accept and move on from immediately. One is that the aviation industry, airlines, have played a significant role in the socio-economic growth of the world and of tourism as a sector in particular. Second, that COVID has decimated the airline industry, which is still licking its wounds as we speak. However, those two facts do not obviate the other fact, which is that COVID has in many ways awakened people's awareness about two significant things. First, personal health, and that includes the impact of pollution on one's health and immediate surroundings. And secondly, on the environment and on the need to safeguard our environment, because obviously with COVID, people have had more time to appreciate the beauty and the serenity of the environment, given that industries were slower and therefore the impact was less felt during those times. So I think the issue of the environment is clearly now at the forefront of everybody's mind. That's why the G7 have focused on it. That's why we're having this panel. And I think the industry, the aviation industry, would do well to actually deal with that issue and be on the front foot, as opposed to being on the back foot, trying to emphasize its contribution to socioeconomic growth, which is not being denied. But I think it also needs to step up to that particular challenge today. Okay, in 2016, ICAO came up with the sought to improve the aviation fuel efficiency by 2% per year, and had this global aspirational goal of carbon neutral growth from 2020, now 2019 onwards, with more fuel efficient aircraft, technology, with development and deployment of sustainable aviation fuels, improved air traffic management, market-based measures, like its CORSIA, Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. Now, let's also recognize one thing, and I think if we go out of our aviation bubble, we will hear a lot of people criticizing offsetting as a means for companies to, in a way, pay lip service to the need for environmental responsibility whilst avoiding any meaningful action on net emissions reductions. I mean, Greenpeace was quoted as saying, and I'll quote it here, that this whole strategy is a flight of fancy. Carbon offsetting is simply an excuse to carry on with business as usual, while shifting the responsibility to cut emissions to someone else, somewhere else, and some other time. It's greenwash, pure and simple, and ministers should be wary of lending it any credibility, end of quote. Now, you may recall that IATA's AGM last November, the airlines reiterated the industry's commitment to carbon neutral growth from the start of 2021 with CORSIA, to cut net CO2 emissions to half by 2005, half the 2005 levels by 2050, and to explore pathways to zero net emissions by 2060-65. Now, I take the view that offering to balance good and harm, or to do less harm, or even to do much more good than harm, are clearly not as powerful and meaningful as committing to only do good. And for me, COVID-19 has led to aviation's CO2 emissions to drop by 60%, according to the Global Carbon Project. And I think that provides an incredible window of unexpected opportunity, admittedly, during the airline industry's worst financial nightmare, for all aviation stakeholders to come together and credibly and diligently address its environmental challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Okay, Vijay, I'm sorry, I'm in some sort of reverie. As someone born in England, every time I hear you speak like the perfect English gentleman, and you say things in such a courteous fashion. I want to pick up, just before asking Chris to comment on this, because Chris is a real expert on this, I just want to pick up that point that you made. The industry position, and Paul is one of the people who crafted it, says that by 2050, we will reduce our emissions to 1/2 of 2005 levels. That's what the industry is saying, 1/2 of 2005 levels. And almost everyone else in the world, in society, is saying that by 2050, we will have a net zero. The UN is advocating, is organizing a race to zero, which all the big companies in the world are becoming a part of. Don't you think, Vijay, that the industry position of 1/2 of 2005 levels by 2050 is the same sort of cop-out that we saw with something like the Warsaw Convention, which held back reasonable insurance rates for so many years? It's a group of self-interested airlines making a declaration which is frankly Neanderthal. Question, what do you think, Vijay?
I think, I mean, it's a fair question, but I think to be fairer, we need to put this in context. When the aviation sector came up with its, let's say, environmental mitigation plan, it was the first sector in the world to do so. And from a zero commitment prior to this to delivering, let's say, 1/2 the emissions by 2050 was obviously a significant improvement. Now, in today's environment, with hindsight, you can say this plan does not go far enough. But let's be fair, at the time it was devised, it was progressive. Obviously, time has caught up with it, and it's time to actually revisit that plan. That's why I keep saying that I think rather than the industry delaying doing this, the industry should actually take a step up, take a step forward, and basically take the lead in doing the right thing. Not because that's what the right thing to do, but that's because what they believe in. We believe that the license for this industry to survive will depend on its ability to come up with a credible plan of action to actually significantly reduce and have meaningful targets for its emissions. And I think the important thing in doing this, I think, is to highlight that this cannot be done by the aviation sector, aviation airlines alone. All the stakeholders must join in there. And I think that's where the airlines can push, because the airlines are end users of fuel, of aircraft, of air traffic control systems, which we all know need to be significantly enhanced to be environmentally more credible, which means that rather than basically trying to play it safe in some ways, the airlines should take the lead and push the other stakeholders to actually step up by saying, because if you look at the basket of measures which ICAO adopted, we've been focusing so much on offsetting, on CORSIA, but the other elements to me are just as critically important. So that CORSIA should be the sort of default last kind of resort kind of thing. We should be focusing on delivering more fuel efficient aircraft technology, more sustainable aviation fuels, and climate friendly air traffic management. If we were to focus on those three things, and that means the airlines pushing for all the other stakeholders, government, air traffic control managers, aircraft manufacturers, the research body. I mean, you can see how when the world is motivated and organized, research and development can actually be fast-tracked. We've just seen it at play with COVID, which means that we need to have a target, a commitment that I think will then drive the resources. It will drive government's focus and commitments. I think the airline would do well to actually take that lead rather than stick to a pre-COVID commitment, which as obviously is already past its sell-by date.
Yeah. The reason why in 2015 I proposed to the Arab Air Carriers presidents the idea of a moonshot, it was exactly for the reasons that you've described. The ecosystem for air transport is very disparate. Governments have a huge role. Air traffic navigation people have a huge role. And as you put it so clearly, if there was a holistic approach, then that would put so much more intelligence and pressure to bear on changes. But just to ask you one last question before passing on to Chris, don't you agree that if the airlines are to take the lead, they could join everybody else in the world by accepting an ambition, and this is only an ambition, to have zero carbon, indeed zero greenhouse gas, by 2050. And that would be the first thing. And Willie Walsh, a new Director General at IATA, has a wonderful opportunity to bring that kind of thing into play. Would you agree with that, Vijay?
I think it's time for a bold move. And I think credibility is key, even more so in today's environment than ever before. So if the airline sector wants to be taken seriously on this subject, it really has to up its game. What it came up with 10, 15 years ago is no longer going to be seen as even an aspiration. So we need to actually go up and actually identify what is that long shot, you can call it a moonshot, which the airline needs to commit to, and then work with the others to identify who needs to do what by when to reach there. Because the airlines alone will never reach there. But the airlines can actually be the one taking the lead to actually identify that challenge, and even as a moonshot, put it there as a moonshot. This is not saying we have a pathway to it, but it needs to be identified, and then the resources need to be mobilized accordingly. That is what will drive change. I mean, that's how we got to the moon, or the Americans got to the moon. Somebody identified this aspirational goal, and then everybody started working on it. So we need that kind of leadership. We need that kind of inspiration. We need a moral leadership on that issue, not a commercial leadership.
I'll take that as a yes, BJ.
I said definite yes.
Okay, Chris, the floor is yours. There's nobody better positioned in the world than Chris Lyle, because not only was he the leader of ICAO's efforts in this field in the 1970s and 80s when we were in Montreal together, but he's also one of the best analysts that there is of the aviation world. Chris, the floor is yours. I'm very grateful that you changed your plans to join us tonight.
Chris, please unmute yourself. We cannot hear you. You're muted. Now
You should
go.
be now. Yeah, I thought you had muted me. Okay. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. That's a very generous introduction. I should say that when we used to play rugby together, I was famous for dropping the ball. So hopefully I won't do that today. I'd like to talk. You asked me to talk about whether ICAO was a leader or a follower, and following on from what Vijay was saying, and what you have talked about, the moonshot. One of the difficulties, of course, is that the original moonshot by the United States was by a single country. ICAO has 193 member states. It is very difficult to get them all on the same page. And I don't think ICAO per se has ever been the leader. It's tended to wait for industry. Having said that, I think it's definitely a leader, and necessarily so, given that it's a global issue, and you have to have a global issue. And I think it's beginning to change. In Europe in particular, we've seen governments taking a lead beyond the airlines, and hopefully some of that will transfer across into ICAO. But one of the issues that ICAO has, it's a global issue, as I mentioned, but there are two basic principles which clash. One is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which talks about common but differentiated responsibilities. And ICAO, under the Chicago Convention, has an issue of equal application. And that context is very difficult to put together. And you have to congratulate ICAO for coming up with CORSIA, the carbon offsetting scheme, because it managed to package the two together. But as we have seen, it's based on offsets, and I would say it's not a last resort. In fact, it's the primary tool in ICAO's basket of measures at the present time. And another unfortunate problem with it is it's based on carbon neutral growth, which means that everything below 2019 issues is not covered. And yet these emissions continue to go into the atmosphere every day. I must say that ICAO continues to do great work. It's done great work, particularly on raising the profile and action by individual countries. It's developed a number of state action plans, which I think is great. And they've had a series of something called the Global Aviation Dialogues, which have really spread the word and raised the profile and got people thinking about the issue. And in the past 18 months, it has perhaps become the global leader through various issues, including in particular something called stock-taking exercises, which were very informative and very impressive. The problem, though, I see, is that how on earth do you turn that into government policy, given that you've got 193 contracting states? The present issue, too, I think, as Paul has spelled out, I think the key way forward certainly for the next 20 years is sustainable aviation fuels. Sustainable aviation fuels, notably waste-based fuel, to avoid the ones that Paul said, synthetic e-fuels, are the primary and the necessary means of bridging both the time and emissions gaps pending a substantial contribution by things like fuel cell electric and hydrogen-powered aircraft. But present fuel production of SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, and take-up are negligible. We've heard very high costs. There's an urgent need to get things going. So we have to move forward, and some of the thoughts that are out there, and this is where ICAO itself runs into difficulties. One of them is we need progressive sustainable aviation fuel blending mandates by governments and commitments by airlines. And on the price issue, if you increase the blending mandate slowly, then you also increase the price slowly. And that's the only way you can do it anyway, because it would take too long to get these mandates up to very high levels. We also need, I think, tax credits for SAF suppliers, both producers and the airports. And again, that is a difficult thing for ICAO to handle. I believe we need levies on aviation fossil fuels, but this is in the past, this has been rejected widely. But I think they should be ring-fenced, so that you put a tax, say a carbon tax on aviation fuel, but you ring-fence it towards sustainable aviation fuel production and purchase. It would be nice to have certified sustainable aviation fuel products as in CORSIA, but here again, this issue, you get people like Russia and Saudi Arabia who are opposed because they're not that enthusiastic about sustainable aviation fuels, rather more, in the case of Saudi Arabia, something called low carbon aviation fuels, which are just cleaned up fuels from kerosene. We also, it's interesting to see that people like Lufthansa and United now applying offsets to sustainable aviation fuel by airlines through corporate customers, which I think is great. At the same time, we need sustainable aviation fuel investment guarantees and green financing by governments. Again, that's difficult for ICAO. And I would like to see, something we need to do is to prioritize applicable alternative fuel production to the aviation sector. The aviation sector is very different than the rest of the transport and global world, other economic world, because it doesn't have any alternative at the moment to kerosene fuels. So much of what is required, I believe, is beyond aviation, never mind beyond ICAO. And it really goes to the responsibility of individual governments and perhaps people like the EU. And at present, one of the issues is that international aviation is treated separately under the global regulatory framework. This is dating back to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, where international aviation is not included in the national budgets, something called nationally determined contributions, which means that, and it's given through ICAO. This means that it takes some of the pressure off governments. There is a trend now towards saying that it should be included in national determined contributions. And there, in fact, there's a move for this to happen at COP26 in Glasgow this year. And that does not mean you're taking away the role of ICAO. It simply means you're putting more pressure on governments to do something individually or through ICAO. And it's also a myth that people say that international aviation is not covered under the Paris Agreement. It is covered under the Paris Agreement by inclusion, because there's no specific mention of it. There was some mention of it, in fact, in the draft the very last night before they decided to cut the whole thing down, the agreement down in Paris, in order to get it across the floor. So this is not to say that ICAO will not continue to play a key role. It will certainly retain responsibility, will always have a key role, particularly on something called monitoring, reporting, and verification, actually assessing how much CO2 and other gases is shoved out by the aircraft, and saying how much governments are doing something about it. But perhaps a slightly changed role is required in regarding the global policy, and a different relationship between ICAO and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So I'll stop there, Jeffrey.
Okay, thank you. I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with the late Peter Sutherland, who you may remember was the in his final career after being an EU commissioner, was the head of the World Trade Organization. And I knew Peter very well, and we were having lunch in Geneva, and we were discussing the fact that the airlines were pressuring at that stage that aviation should not be included in the World Trade Organization. And if you talk to many people, they'll say, well, it's not included. And Peter Sutherland said to me, if I had $1 for every industry who came to me and said we shouldn't be included because we have different characteristics or we have special characteristics, I could retire tomorrow and we'd have no GATS agreement. And I think what you've just described, Chris, is one of those situations where the existential issue of climate change is not being dealt with from a policy viewpoint in ICAO. It's being dealt with in the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Agency, under the Paris Convention. And I think that the important though the Chicago Convention and ICAO is, if the issue is an existential issue, there isn't any real reason why aviation should not also be included in the nationally determined contributions. And the second point I'd like to make is, if the G20 took a political position that they thought that they needed to accentuate sustainable aviation fuel in the same way that President Biden is accentuating infrastructure and build back better, I can't believe that the supply and the price question wouldn't be solved, even if, as I say, the consequence is the price is higher, so long as there's adequate supply. And I make my point again, that the big fossil fuel companies, the most rich companies in the world, are making arguments that say things like, well, aviation's such a small part of the total mix, is just bullshit. Anyhow, at this stage, I'm going to open the floor for comments and thoughts and views from anybody here. Thomas has shown himself to be very adroit in these sessions at allowing and encouraging people to participate. So I'm going to ask, if you'd like to make a comment, there's some device that lets you raise your hand, and Thomas and I will keep a check on you, and the floor is yours, and we'll have 20 to 30 minutes of exchanges, and then we'll bring this to an end, because more than an hour on Zoom puts people to sleep.
Yeah, you can, Jeffrey. Yes, thank you. And you can actually just click on the hand raising symbol, and we indicate that you wanted to say something, and we give you the floor. Maybe in the meantime, I'd like to recognize and maybe welcome and give him a chance to say a few words. Dr. Taleb Rifai, who was the former Secretary General of the UNWTO and is our co-chair since we started this discussion. And I think he's joining us from Amman, Jordan. Hi, Taleb.
Hello, how are you? Am I heard now?
Yes, we can hear you. How are you?
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jürgen. You're always coming up with good, beautiful initiatives, especially with Jeffrey. I want to praise Jeffrey first for his commitment, lifetime commitment to the issue of climate change. And thank everybody here, Paul, Vijay, Chris, all good friends. I want to say something now as a non-expert in aviation. I know nothing about aviation. I can't speak like Paul does about the efficiency of fuel, what fuel to use or not to use, or how to make fuel more efficient, or to use fuel or not to use fuel altogether. What I can speak about is the contribution of aviation altogether to carbon emission in the world. Jeffrey said it's 3%. Well, 3% is 3%. It's not 30% and it's not 0%. It's 3%. We need to be very serious about it. Let me be clear here. I'm for 2050 being a target for zero emission, but I don't think we should waste so much time and energy in climate change just on aviation. I think aviation companies, especially manufacturers and airlines, have done a great job so far. And I don't think it's fair to put all the blame on them. Now, Jeffrey knows very well, 70 to 75% of carbon emission comes out of cities. And people are going to be living more and more in cities. Growth of mankind is not going to stop. Nobody's going to stop it. And by the year 2030, more than 50% of the people of the world are going to be living in cities. So cities are going to have to grow. Emission will grow. Now, I think that's a more worthwhile battle to fight. I'm not saying don't fight this battle, Jeffrey, don't misunderstand me. I think it's a very important battle because aviation is very, very important. I think we should concentrate more on manufacturers rather than on airlines themselves. Manufacturers can come up with good, innovative ideas about this. But let's put things into real perspective. It's 3% we're talking about, 3.5%, 4% of total carbon emission. Now, shouldn't we be concentrating more on skyscrapers? Skyscraper, for example, in a city could be a disastrous energy consumer, and it could be at the same time the best solar collector in the world, or the best vertical garden in the world. That's what I want to add here from a non-expert perspective. Thank you so much, Jürgen, for allowing me to speak. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure, Taleb, to listen to you. We worked together for many years at the UN Tourism Organization, and you always had a capacity to bring a slightly alternative position onto the table and to force people to have to take account of it. And it's good to see you looking so well, and good to see you home in Jordan.
Thank you.
One of the points that you made, I agree with you, the carbon issue around buildings and cities is immensely significant. And, you know, the climate people's vision is we have to deal with that as well. And they have mechanisms for dealing with that. The problem, as Paul outlined on aviation, is not the 3% that it is today, but the 15 to 20% that some of the studies say it can be if we don't find a solution to our problem. Skyscrapers have a solution to their problem. And it seems to me, just trying to be totally dispassionate, we all want aviation to succeed. And I think I'd like to throw back to Paul and to Vijay, your point, where you said that the manufacturers have a big role to play here. Airbus has announced that it will have an all-hydrogen plane by 2035.
That is great.
Boeing has announced that it will have a 100% sustainable aviation fuel compliant fleet by 2030. So to Paul and Vijay, and Chris, if you want to comment, isn't this the sort of mid-term solution or significant solution, even though it means that the aircraft, that the airlines, Paul, will have to re-equip significantly? Paul?
Okay, I'm here. I think, look, Jeffrey, I mean, I concur with everything that really has been said in terms of it's time for the industry to take another big leap forward and hope that the governments in ICAO will somehow find a way of at least leaping half as far. And we have an opportunity next year at the Triennial Assembly to do that. You know, if you look at everything that's out there, and you know, I've heard about electric aircraft, and it's probable that there will be short-haul electric aircraft for maybe 100 people that can fly for an hour by, say, 2030, 2035. But that's not solving the long-haul issue, and the long-haul issue is the big issue. And that's where you need creative solutions. And the only viable one right now is sustainable alternative fuel made from biomass. The work on hydrogen, even though Airbus made that announcement a few months ago, my understanding is that they're getting a bit nervous about that, because looking at the technicalities of producing, distributing hydrogen and not just converting, but replacing what by then will be something like 50,000 aircraft around the world is a huge undertaking. And so I think, you know, I'm always nervous about trying to go for something that everybody thinks is the holy grail, which is hydrogen, when there is a solution out there that's being underexploited at the moment that could make a significant impact on the emissions of CO2 today. And remember, there is a cumulative effect on CO2. So every ton we can avoid emitting today avoids that accumulating into the atmosphere in the future. So for me, the priority has to be on the short to medium term to begin with. Yes, we can work on hydrogen. Yes, we can work on electricity, but let's maximize the opportunity that's there. It's such an exciting thing. 10 years ago, that didn't exist.
Yeah, and the point that I think it was Chris made about the waste, household waste to SAF, that produces a virtuous circle, because you're solving the waste problem and solving the aviation fuel problem at the same time. And I can't for the life of me see why there hasn't been more investment in that particular activity.
Well, that is happening, Jeffrey. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right, because I mean, I quickly looked at some numbers. I mean, in the EU alone, there was 184 million tons of household waste produced in 2018. And most of that, a big chunk of that, just went to landfill. And if it goes to landfill, it produces methane, which has an even greater impact on climate change. So by using that to convert it into jet fuel, you're avoiding the landfill issue, you're avoiding the methane issue, and you're actually reducing CO2 emissions. That's exactly what they're trying to do in Schiphol Airport. There's a company called Sky Energy doing that. And British Airways and a company called Velocis are doing that in the UK to supply London City Airport with fuel made from household waste from 5 boroughs in the east part of London.
Good. Thank you very much, Paul. We have Dr. Julian Zarbin. I think you're joining us from Malta, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Thomas.
Raising his hand. How are you?
Yes, Thomas, thank you very much. And congratulations to Jeffrey and yourself for this initiative, which is, you know, you have such wonderful, you know, think tanks. My only worry, Jeffrey and Thomas, are that all the think tanks and all these talks are great. You know, I mean, even the initiative, Jeffrey has a lifetime commitment to climate change and proper responsible travel. He's even gone as far as in Malta setting up courses for climate change and for travel. This is, you know, to be recommended worldwide. What worries me is, where are the politicians? Where are the decision makers? There seems to be a gap between the politician, you know, even in Malta itself, you know, little Malta itself, but everywhere around the world, there seems to be this gap between politicians, academics, researchers, and practitioners. And we always seem to talk around the same thing. We've been talking about sustainable and responsible travel for nearly close to 40, 50 years now. And, you know, very little has changed. We now need to step into the next stage. We need to get things moving. I know that, you know, you can plant a little seed and that'll grow into a wonderful tree. That's something, you know, which I know Jeffrey is very used to doing. But we need to do this very urgently, because otherwise what's going to happen, we're going to go from one think tank to another and very little is going to be put into practice. You know, otherwise, you know, it's wonderful every time to listen to you and to participate in all these discussions, Thomas, but I hope that we can move into the next stage very, very soon. Thank you.
And I couldn't agree.
As you're talking, Julian, I'm thinking, first of all, thank you for your kind words. I'm thinking of something really practical that could be done at COP26. And Paul, I'm throwing this to Paul Steele. The dreadful air passenger duty in the United Kingdom is raising billions of dollars a year, which is going from airline passengers into the treasury. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the British government, as a host of COP26, channeled that money into investment into waste to aviation fuel? Wouldn't that be a good thing? And wouldn't that be a good thing for all of the carbon taxes that are coming up in the future? And they will come up and they will be law. If the governments could make commitments that they would transmute that into support for sustainable aviation fuel.
But Jeffrey, I mean, in an ideal world, I would 100% buy into that. Unfortunately, I've sat through too many meetings in Her Majesty's Treasury in the UK where they always trot out the same line, which is Her Majesty's Treasury does not hypothecate taxation. So basically, you know, you give us your money and we put it in our pockets and we do with it what we want. Chris and I have talked about this as well. I mean, this would be a fantastic solution to financing and providing the capital necessary for the moonshot on sustainable alternative fuels. But I may be a little bit more jaundiced in my expectations that governments may start actually, if you like, labeling their taxation for specific purposes. But it would be a fantastic solution.
But to pick up Julian's point about nothing coming out of think tanks, what if you, Paul, and you, Chris, and me, and some others wrote a paper that we put through somewhere to COP26 through one of the mechanisms that we have a link to, and also put to people like IATA, I'm sure they would get behind an intelligent repurposing of the APD and preempting governments from grabbing the funds from carbon taxes and put it into the promotion of sustainable aviation fuel with a strong emphasis on household waste. How about doing that, Paul?
I think it's a good idea. There's various, let's say, initiatives in train already, both in preparation for the COP, but also I think for, you know, we've got to look forward and remember it takes a lot of preparation time to get governments familiarized with things. So I think the other opportunities I mentioned before is the run up to the ICAO Assembly in the fall of 2022.
Yeah,
can I take that as a qualified agreement?
Oh, so more than a qualified agreement.
Excellent.
But
yeah,
Jeffrey,
and Jeffrey, you're leading our interest group on green, so this would be a very good opportunity also to let us know, and we can give it some publicity. And
well, I think the people that we have on this panel, and throwing this out to anybody else who's listening, I don't think it would take more than a week to produce a thoughtful paper on creating a financing mechanism for sustainable aviation fuel that would make it much more feasible. And then we all have links to institutions, and I think we could put some public pressure on this. And Thomas, I know that you would be willing to take this up as a WTN initiative. And it answers Julian's point about let's do something out of one of these sessions.
No, great idea. And
Yeah, but I think, Jeffrey, it's important to recognize that, see, action is important. And I think your suggestion about doing a paper, I would say is critical to put it in a wider context, as opposed to focusing on financing. Because for me, the financing will focus the minds of some in a positive way or in a negative way, because you always have people who are mindful about costs of travel and so on. But if you were to put it in a wider context, that, see, by the end of 2019, aviation emissions were 70% higher than they were in 2005, and they were expected to grow by 300% by 2050. So we really want the whole world, including the aviation sector, to recognize that this was a path, a perilous path. And in some ways, COVID has halted that path, which has given us a reason to pause. So we should not waste that pause by trying to get back on the same path we were before. And I think, to Julian's point, which I think is critical, that we should recognize that a holistic approach is necessary, because no one stakeholder can fix this. And no one stakeholder has all the solutions. Even when the manufacturers say that they will provide aircraft which will be possible to have 100% sustainable alternative fuels, that's not enough, because somebody needs to produce that fuel, somebody needs to buy it. So I think everybody must work together, and this is where governments have a role to play in terms of bringing all the stakeholders together. And the stakeholders are obviously the airlines, the aircraft manufacturers, the air traffic control providers, the researchers, the research and development people, people who can think outside the box and really connect the dots. Because what you don't want also is great ideas which actually are great for aviation in some respect, but actually cause even more harm somewhere else. So somebody needs to look at this in a bigger frame, but recognize, I think it has to start with, where do we want to end? We clearly do not want to end where we were destined to end before 2019, which was a 300% growth in our emissions by 2050. We want to have a real challenging target, which we set. We said, this is where we commit to. And now, how do we get there? And this is where your idea, Jeffrey, of actually getting people together to devise then the plan to get us there from where we are today, so that by next year we have made some improvements and we keep improving towards until we reach our target. This is where you build credibility, because you're moving positively on your journey, and you actually get people to buy into what you're trying to do. But all stakeholders must be brought to the table. And that, I think, is where ICAO can play a definite role. It cannot allow itself to be led. It has to lead this initiative.
Vijay, you've just written the perfect preamble to the paper.
You inspire me, Jeffrey. No, wonderful.
And because Thomas records everything, like the US Justice Department, he is. We have all the information available. I'm quite taken taken by Julian's thought that it would be nice if something came out of this. I don't think it would do any harm to have the ICAO assembly as an ultimate focal point, but it would be a lot of fun to have COP26 as a way station with a real emphasis, and taking Vijay's point about we need to have a holistic approach, but a real emphasis on SAF and the intelligent use of the APD, I think could get a massive amount of support.
No, a great idea, and hopefully we can follow up on this, Jeffrey. When I'm going through our chat room, I know we're now a little bit an hour and 15 minutes into this discussion, so we have to wrap it up. But I see there's an active discussion going on, and Peter Bayern from Tanzania has been leading this discussion almost. I don't know, Peter, if you wanted to say something or add something to what you put up in writing there.
Thank you, Jürgen, and good evening to everybody. Two things leap out at me. One is that in all these discussions, we never talk about the individual. We always talk about the governments. The governments have to do this. The governments have to do that. The institutions have to do this or that. But actually, Jeffrey, I'm addressing you on this. You know the statistics on how many people really care about their footprint, how many people are really buying into sustainability with their actions, where they stay, where they go. I'm a hotelier, but I've also been in domestic aviation. So I know, for example, this is the other problem I want to bring up, and that is the issue of approvals for new fuels, new engines, new aircraft. Paul and Vijay, I'm sure, understand this much better than I do, how long it takes to get approval from the aviation organizations. And that may require inter-country approvals. For example, some countries may not want aircraft arriving in Addis Ababa or Nairobi or somewhere else that have a different kind of fuel for which they have to be prepared for issues like fire, accident, and blah and blah and blah. So there's an international system. Of course, it's part of ICAO, part of IATA responsibility, but it takes forever to get these things through the hoops. So I'm wondering, look how we fast-tracked COVID vaccines. Are we thinking about fast-tracking these developments in aviation? And on top of all of this, I think again and again and again, we have to bring the story home to people that their actions also matter. In the chat room, we were talking about how some governments are looking at insisting on people traveling by train rather than taking short-haul domestic flights. I'm all for it. I think that's brilliant. But you've got to get the people on board because we're supposed to be democracies.
But to your point, Peter, on the first point, I think that the young people have a different mindset. I say this not only from looking at what Greta Thunberg did with the no-fly movement in Scandinavia, but just as Julian said, we're running a course at the moment. We've had 30 to 40 young people from around the world, and their mindset is different. They are prepared not to fly. They do have a very strong view. And if you put that in the context of Vijay's 300% increase, as you move forward over the next 10 to 20 years, I think these people will let their voices be known. And if the industry isn't seen to be responsive, then I think you'll get a lot more no-fly movements.
Yeah, as somebody with a 22-year-old daughter, I'm fully with you. But unfortunately, the people who have the spending power to travel and to move around, whether it be business travel, and don't forget the business travel, and as Paul said, don't forget the cargo, they're not young. Actually, many of them are unemployed thanks to COVID, or many partially employed or have had their job chances dented. So we can't wait for them to come on stream as the main spenders on travel. So I hear you and I agree with you, but not sure we have time for that.
Okay.
No. Well, we don't have anyone raising a hand right now. There is an active discussion still going on in chat, and this can continue. This also can continue on World Tourism Network. And if anyone else wanted to add something to it, please raise your hand now. Otherwise, I think we can, if that's okay, Jeffrey, bring this to an end today and look forward to the next discussion and some action. So we can report about results, what would be wonderful.
Yeah, Thomas,
Jürgen,
let me just say that I think it's time to bring it to an end, but I'll take a responsibility to putting, to engaging with Paul and Chris and VJ, and putting the framework of what would not be more than a 6-page paper together, which focuses on, particularly on the APD, and Boris Johnson making a huge, generous effort in the interest of the world community in doing nothing, which would be a problem because the money's only sitting in the Treasury, so he could just repurpose it. And we could argue that, Paul, that that's not really the dreadful hypothecation, it's simply a repurposing. Well, thank you very much, Thomas, and you have the floor back.
No, thank you very much, and thank you, Jeffrey, VJ, Paul, and Chris, for being on this panel today. I think we all learned a lot, and hopefully we can take home a lot out of this, and we're looking forward to continue our conversation. Also, thank you, Peter, Taleb, and everyone else for making a contribution. Also wanted to recognize, I call her Snow White in Serbia. She's leading our educational forum. She's always with us, and thank you for this. And if you wanted to, if you wanted to listen to it or watch this again, it'll be on our YouTube channel. You can link to it from World Tourism Network, or simply go to livestream.travel. We're also going to show this probably for the next day or two live on eTurboNews. So this will be repeated, and hopefully a lot more people will watch what we have been discussing here today. Other than that, I'm looking forward to my morning coffee at 6:30 here in the morning now in Hawaii, and start a beautiful Hawaiian day. And for those that are about to go to sleep, like VJ, I think it's a little bit past midnight or 12:30 in the morning in Singapore. Thank you, everyone in the world, for joining us. Paul and Jeffrey, I know it's evening, and you have a nice dinner. And same to you, Peter. And it's great to have all of you on board. And thank you again. For those that are listening to us and don't know anything what World Tourism Network is about, just go to WTN.travel, and hopefully you can join us. Well, I can only say aloha from my part of the world, what is Hawaii, to everywhere else. And thank you again, guys, and we see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Bye.
Thank you, Thomas. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Jeffrey. Bye-bye, Jeffrey.
Bye, Julian. Thank you for your contribution.
Bye. Bye, Jeffrey.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, Paul. Bye, Paul. We'll be in touch.
Bye. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Bye.
Mario,
Bye.
Thank you. Arrivederci.
Bye-bye.
Budi.
Bye-bye.
Tiana no, I'm sorry, I forgot my thank you in Indonesia. How do you pronounce it again, Moody? Tell me.
Bye.
Yeah. She's muted. She doesn't want to talk to me, but that's fine. Okay, see you guys later.